All of this merely sets the stage for the greatest public relations whitewash in history. It is information that is required to understand the meaning of the great cover-up for those of us living in the 21st century. How many understand the basic facts of world history? During the Middle Ages, information was withheld from the common man. Education was restricted to the ruling elite. It was difficult to know what went on outside one's immediate village. That enforced ignorance meant power for the ruling classes. We now live in the age of information overload, and yet information is withheld from the common man almost as skillfully as it was during the Middle Ages. It's done now through brainwashing. And how do you brainwash an entire generation of free people? You let them brainwash themselves. Provide them entertainment. Call it education. Filter out what you don't want them to see. Bury them in garbage that keeps them riveted to the screen but does not assist them in understanding and preserving the freedoms and resources that enhance the quality of their own lives. Just don't call it propaganda. For nearly 1,000 years, the papacy had been the dominant force in Western Europe. Its power and influence had risen steadily, and as its power increased, so did its level of arrogance and corruption. It became easier and easier, even for simple people, to see the difference between the Christ who washed his disciples' feet and the Pope who demanded that kings kiss his. While even early on the whisper of Antichrist could be heard regarding the Bishop of Rome, as the centuries progressed, those voices grew louder and louder. Voices of men who had access to the Bible, men from within the church itself. Some were silenced in prison, others were burned at the stake. But the wave of indignation that was rising against the corrupt medieval church could not be held in check. Men of courage risked their lives translating the Bible into the languages of the common people, and the development of the printing press placed it in their hands. They could now look back over the centuries and see how the various identifying marks found their fulfillment in the papal system. The Protestant Reformation rocked the Christian world. Eventually, Martin Luther, John Calvin, John Knox, and the other leaders of the Protestant Reformation came to believe that the Roman Catholic Church had fallen beyond the reach of reform. They may have disagreed on some things, but they all agreed on one thing, that the Roman Catholic papacy was the subject of these prophetic symbols. They referred to them collectively as the Antichrist. You will recall that I have been adamant about the fact that there is no the Antichrist spoken of in the Bible, and that is true. The Reformers knew that. For them, the term Antichrist served as a shorthand term referring to all of the prophetic symbols as a group, not to any individual person. Even when they directed their remarks regarding Antichrist to the Pope himself, they did so with the full understanding that it was the religious political system they were opposing and not merely the man. It was the system who had ruled Europe for 1,000 years. Martin Luther said it like this: "The Pope is the very Antichrist who has exalted himself above and opposed himself against Christ because he will not permit Christians to be saved without his power, which nevertheless is nothing, and is neither ordained nor commanded by God. Therefore, just as little as we can worship the devil himself as Lord and God, can we endure his apostle, the Pope or Antichrist, in his rule as head or Lord. For to lie and to kill, and to destroy body and soul eternally, that is wherein his papal government really consists, as I have very clearly shown in many books." And John Calvin said it like this: "Daniel and Paul foretold that the Antichrist would sit in the temple of God. With us, it is the Roman pontiff we make the leader and standard-bearer of that wicked and abominable kingdom. The conviction of the papacy being the Antichrist of prophecy did not begin the Protestant Reformation, but it became the issue that caused the actual separation. It also provided many Christians with the courage to be bound to stakes and burned to death in public rather than renounce that conviction. It was that very conviction that tore Europe apart at the seams politically. Entire nations, much of Northern Europe, renounced the Roman Catholic religion altogether and expelled it from their borders as a political force. Whether they like it or not, every Protestant church on the face of the earth today was born from the conviction that the Roman Catholic papal system is the Antichrist of Bible prophecy. Not a single man, but a man who spans more than 14 centuries. For hundreds of years after the Reformation, you'd have had a hard time finding a Protestant who did not believe that. All Protestant churches understood the nature of papal politics. But some years back I asked a young Lutheran minister if he knew who Martin Luther thought the Antichrist was. He gave me the deer in headlights look, so I told him. Luther said it was the papacy. It's right there in your Book of Concord. Well, he said, not many Lutherans believe that anymore. Indeed, not many Protestants believe that anymore, which takes us to the very heart of the great cover-up. How do you cover up more than 1,000 years of tyranny, corruption, fraud, exploitation, deviance, and brutality? You whitewash the centuries. You claim that the Bible never mentions them. Then you replace them with the Antichrist hoax, which is simply this. The Antichrist has nothing to do with the papacy. It's either Nero or someone back in the 1st century, or some military dictator or slick international businessman at the end of time. But the 2,000 years in between, that's off limits. If you are unfamiliar with the true contextual interpretation of Bible prophecy, the 800-year war that the Catholic hierarchy has waged against the Bible would hardly make any sense. Once you know what the Bible says, that war makes a great deal of sense. When you understand that the composite beast of Revelation 13 represents the medieval papacy, verse 2 takes on great significance. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth was as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, and his seat, and great authority. Who is the dragon? Just 10 verses earlier, in chapter 12, verse 9, it says, the great red dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan. How much education or intelligence is required to connect those dots? The papacy is not part of God's kingdom. It works for the devil. No wonder the papacy has made war against the Bible. It doesn't comply with the rules of political correctness. And who but the God of the universe could rightfully discern that such a kind-looking man as this, by virtue of his office in the chair of St. Peter, derives his power and authority from the devil himself? It certainly is a radical idea, and many have been burned at the stake for believing it. Few are aware of the untiring efforts of the medieval Roman Catholic hierarchy to keep the Bible out of the hands of anyone but their own clergy, or of their crusades to exterminate large populations of Christians living among them who patterned their lives after the Bible and rejected Roman Catholic doctrine. For centuries it was not only a mortal sin to own even a portion of the Bible, but also a crime punishable by the cruelest forms of torture and death at the hands of the dreaded Inquisition. Two things changed that: the Protestant Reformation and the printing press. When Protestantism swept over Europe, the Catholic Church responded with military campaigns to try to recover the lost ground, and initiated brutal repressive measures to stamp out the Protestant heresy in their own lands. As it became apparent that the Reformation could not be crushed by brute force, attention was given to diffusing the Protestant claims of the papal Antichrist. For hundreds of years, the Roman Catholic leadership had been aware of the power of the Bible and the threat it posed to their clerical monopoly. Men like John Wycliffe and Jan Hus had made more than passing ripples in the papal pond with their Bible-based teaching. Wycliffe, the Englishman, would be hounded and brought to trial, yet live to die in his own bed. Decades later, he was condemned as a heretic and excommunicated posthumously. His bones were exhumed and burned, and the ashes cast into a nearby river. His great crime? He translated the Bible into English. His writings filtered throughout Europe, where the Czech scholar Jan Hus translated them into his native Bohemian language. He was condemned by the same Catholic Council of Constance that condemned Wycliffe's bones. He too was tried, then burned at the stake. It is said that manuscripts of John Wycliffe provided some of the fuel for the fire. These men's testimony reached the hearts of many. Still, as long as the availability of Bibles in the languages of the people could be controlled, so also could the influence of these pestilential heretics. But the printing press changed that forever. In response to the Reformation, a new order arose within the Catholic Church, the Society of Jesus, whose members are known as Jesuits. It was founded by a Spanish soldier turned priest, Ignatius Loyola. Loyola envisioned an order of spiritual soldiers dedicated to the protection and preservation of the papal office and to the destruction of Protestantism. With an emphasis on revitalized scholarship, its method would be teaching, preaching, and gaining influence with the ruling classes of the world. The order would become famous for its educational institutions and extensive missionary work. It would become infamous for tampering with the affairs of sovereign nations, assassinations, intrigue, and its use of disguises, infiltration, and deception. It would be expelled from dozens of nations. Its power would come to threaten the papacy itself to such a degree that in July of 1773, Pope Clement XIV suppressed the order. Shortly thereafter, he was poisoned. It was 41 years later, in 1814, that Pope Pius VII restored the Jesuits. John Adams wrote to Thomas Jefferson, "I do not like the reappearance of the Jesuits. Shall we not have regular swarms of them here, in as many disguises as only the king of the gypsies can assume, dressed as printers, publishers, writers, and schoolmasters? If there ever was a body of men who merited damnation on earth and in hell, it is this society of Loyola's." Nevertheless, we are compelled by our system of religious toleration to offer them an asylum. In June of 1864, nearing the end of the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln confided to a friend, "This war would never have been possible without the sinister influence of the Jesuits. We owe it to popery that we now see our land reddened with the blood of her noblest sons." Hidden among the Jesuits' trophies, it planted the seed in the heart of Protestantism that would grow to what would become the greatest cover-up ever. We have seen how the Protestant Reformation tore into the papal power base in Western Europe and changed the face of the Christian Church. Having ruled the nations of Europe for 1,000 years, the Catholic Church was not about to take it all sitting down. Crusades were launched. Cities were brought under siege. Land was recovered for the Pope, notably in the Netherlands and Belgium, but it was too little, too late. The damage was done. The Bible had escaped into the hands of the laity, and thanks to the printing press, it had been scattered like the leaves of autumn. It is important to remember that while the Reformation focused on some specific theological discussions, such as righteousness and salvation through faith alone, had the Reformers not hung the Antichrist label on the papacy and made it stick, the Reformation would have remained a discussion. It was that label that powered the Reformation, and the Catholic Church knew it. They came to see that they were not going to destroy Protestantism through military force, and they were not going to destroy the Bible physically. They would have to deal with the Antichrist issue. The solution came from two Spanish Jesuits around the year 1600 A.D. Both published dissertations offering alternate views of Bible prophecy in hopes of undermining the Protestant declarations. Francisco Ribera's 500-page commentary appeared around 1591. He proposed that the first few chapters of the book of Revelation concerned ancient pagan Rome. The rest would all take place in a 3.5-year period at the end of time. Antichrist would be an individual person who would persecute the saints of God, rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, abolish the Christian religion, deny Christ, be received by the Jews, pretend to be God, and conquer the world. Not a word in the Bible was spoken about the Church of the Middle Ages. His theory became known as futurism. Some 20 years later, Luis de Alcazar wrote a 900-page tome proposing that all of Revelation was limited to the time of pagan Rome. The book of Revelation describes the rejection of the Jews, the destruction of Jerusalem, the overthrow of paganism, and the conversion of the empire to Christianity. The Antichrist is Nero, who persecuted Christians in the 1st century. And of course, Revelation said nothing about the Church of the Middle Ages. This theory became known as preterism. As contradictory as these two theories were, the papacy blessed them both. It was obviously not concerned who the Antichrist was, but about who it wasn't. Actually, the fact that these two views were contradictory did not matter. They were not intended to instruct the Catholic faithful. They were intended to confuse Protestants and undercut the Reformation. But Protestants weren't buying it, at least not yet. It would be some 300 years before Protestantism would swallow the poisoned pill in a big way. Somewhere around 1791, Manuel de la Cunza, a Jesuit from Chile, wrote a manuscript in Spanish that mirrored the work of the futurist Ribera. He wrote under a false name, claiming to be a converted Jewish rabbi, Juan Josaphat ben Ezra. Edward Irving, a Scottish Presbyterian, liked the book and translated it into English, whereupon Samuel Maitland, the librarian for the Archbishop of Canterbury, read it and adopted the futurist proposition. John Nelson Darby, an Irish Protestant, adopted the futurist view in the 1830s and later brought his ideas to the United States, where they found widespread acceptance. A major milestone occurred when C.I. Scofield, an American Protestant, published his Scofield Reference Bible. It was nothing more than a King James Bible with his futurist notes embedded on each page, but it swung many Protestants toward futurism and paved the way for popular authors like Hal Lindsey to sell millions of copies of his 1970 book, The Late Great Planet Earth, which cemented futurism's claim within Protestantism and promoted Christian Zionism. Is Hal Lindsey himself a Jesuit, as some have suggested? I don't know the answer to that. He is clearly aligned with the Jesuit agenda. As might be expected, The Late Great Planet Earth made some loosely dated predictions that failed to come true. That was no problem, however, for Hal Lindsey, who just kept cranking out more books, making more bucks, and never looking back to say, Sorry about that, folks. But 25 years later, when Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins began publishing their appeal to the next generation of would-be futurists, they did it in the form of fiction. It's safer that way. They called their series Left Behind. While preterism never made the splash within Protestantism that futurism did, it nevertheless found some appeal with certain liberal academic theologians. What I find interesting is that a series of fiction books hawking the preterist agenda began being published in 2005 called The Last Disciple. Both series were published by Tyndale House, an allegedly Protestant company. So both Jesuit views are now published in fictional form by the same Protestant printing house at the same time. To quote a common cliché, can you make this stuff up? And which is stranger, truth or fiction?